CGTN, China Global Television Network.
"2022 has been a year of big weather events. Humanity is bearing the brunt of climate havoc around the world.
The trends of the movements for climate change, nobody can take it back.
Green transition is in urgent need, but massive capital is required. In what way can the financial system provide more support?
Taxonomies and green finance standards to mobilize financing for developing countries through the MDB system.
However, massive investments carry the risk of greenwashing. What can be done to prevent this problem?
Increase the transparency, accountability, and also having more tracking of where the progress has been.
The green lending and green bond markets in China have quickly grown to become among the biggest in the world. What factors contribute to success?
The interaction within China between the public and private sector is extremely healthy.
Watch this week's BizTalk and discover how finance can help make the world a greener place. Only on BizTalk, only on CGTN. Welcome to our special edition of BizTalk, Financing the Greener Future. To address climate change, finance plays a key role. Large-scale investments are required to significantly reduce emissions. Meanwhile, vast amounts of financial resources are needed to adapt to the adverse effects and reduce the impacts of climate change. To understand more about this, we're joined by four distinguished guests today. Sebastian Eckhart, Practice Manager for Macroeconomics and Fiscal at World Bank. Tang Dingding, former chair of Compliance Review Panel of Asian Development Bank. Ma Jun, co-chair of G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And Shuang Liu, China Finance Director at World Resources Institute. So welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. Geopolitical tides have shifted this year. After the difficult effects of the pandemic, energy and food insecurity, inflationary pressures, and spiraling debt have compounded existing climate vulnerabilities and crippled economic growth. As challenging as the moment is, there is a growing concern about whether climate change actions should take a backseat. What is our ability to achieve economic recovery and do so in a greener manner? Dr. Eckhart, let me start with you. How much will ongoing world events such as the energy and food crisis, COVID-19 pandemic overshadow climate actions and resources needed to address climate change? Dr. Eckhart?
Well, I think in some sense, these recent events reinforce the importance of the climate change agenda, notwithstanding, of course, that we see across the world that, short-run crises often distract from these longer-term objectives. But I think, if anything, the energy crisis and also, frankly, the natural disasters, the fact that we experienced one of the warmest years in history last year with devastating droughts across the world, I think reinforces the need to act on climate change and act with urgency.
And Dr. Ma, in your opinion, how are we doing on greening the economic recovery?
On green recovery, using fiscal and financial resources to support the recovery by channeling a larger portion of financial resources to green-related projects at the same time, generating jobs and economic growth. In China, the Green Finance Initiative has started actually a long time ago. What we did in China is building what we call ecosystem of green finance, including taxonomy, which is the definition of green activities, and disclosure requirement that requires the issuer or the borrower to disclose environmental and climate-related information, and product innovation, which will enable all kinds of green projects to be financed. And finally, I think more importantly, it's really the incentives from the central bank, from the fiscal authorities to mobilize and catalyze private sector resource towards green economic activities.
Well, Mr. Tang, we know that in some developed countries, the environmental commitments took a back seat due to the worsening energy crisis. Are you worried about that?
I knew at the moment some of the difficulties, they're facing to contribute more financial resources to the climate change, in particular to the developing countries. However, I have to say that it is, the trends of the movements for climate change. Nobody can take it back. And I do believe that adaptation, financial resources.
And Ms. Liu, in your opinion, how will this ongoing energy crisis affect the transition towards renewables?
What we have noticed is that with the ongoing energy and food crisis, that will potentially reduce the level of public finance that's available from the developed countries to support the climate efforts in developing countries. Most importantly, a lot of the current support provided by developed countries is in the format of the Overseas Development Assistance, or ODA, which is so far the largest source of international financing for a lot of the low-income countries to support their climate efforts. If there will be a further reduce on the ODA, or the Overseas Development Assistance, that will affect the level of the efforts that developing countries can conduct.
Climate change is an archetypal global challenge resulting from greenhouse gas emissions from every country around the world. In order to resolve this issue, international efforts are necessary. In the final hours of UN COP27, a groundbreaking agreement was reached to provide loss and damage funding for developing or vulnerable countries severely affected by climate catastrophes. However, there is still a long way to go for global cooperation after the COP27 climate deal. Cooperating internationally on green finance has become a crucial tool for fulfilling the promise and ultimately tackling climate change. We know that green finance has developed rapidly in the past years. And Dr. Eckhart, what's your view on global cooperation of sustainable finance initiatives?
Well, I think there are many initiatives globally to try to harmonize, for example, taxonomies and green finance standards, to collaborate, of course, on these. I think those are important. There are also efforts, of course, to mobilize financing for developing countries through the MDB system in many ways to then catalyze and leverage more private sector financing. So those are important global initiatives, but I do think that these global initiatives need to be complemented with further steps at the country level. And again, China is a good example in many ways.
Dr. Ma, I just want to go to you now. You have also played a key role in driving international cooperation on green finance. For example, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is an important platform for global coordination of sustainable finance initiatives. Can you tell us a bit more about this and what is its major achievements in recent years?
The G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is now inviting all major international organizations which are involved in green sustainable finance to participate in a progress report review process. And we are conducting this on an annual basis. So on the taxonomy side, we involved an agency like IPSF, which is producing the common ground taxonomy, to discuss with the G20 on how to make progress towards enhancing comparability and interoperability of sustainable finance taxonomy. And on the disclosure side, the G20 endorsed the launch of ISSB, which is hugely important in this space because there are too many different standards, frameworks, principles for disclosure, which is confusing the financial market. And we need to coordinate by producing a set of internationally recognized baseline standard for disclosure. And for that purpose, a framework is needed to define what activities are qualified for transition finance and how the transition activities should disclose their environmental and climate benefits.
Mr. Tang, you've also worked on international cooperation and exchanges for a long time. In your opinion, what more can be done to boost the cooperation?
That is very important. We do recognize the importance of the international cooperation because not only developed country, but also developing country also are facing big challenges regarding to the climate change, regarding to the biodiversity. We feel that we need to working together with different academic, and environment and the think tank, because we need a lot of technical tools and database in order to better understand how to identify the risk of the biodiversity, risk of the climate change, in the process of the project development and the implementation, in order to find good solutions. So therefore, I want to emphasize the importance of the international cooperation, not only for the climate change, but also for the biodiversity.
Ms. Liu, what more can be done to scale up support from multinational development banks and other development finance institutions?
The majority of the current funding we have seen that's been channeled by the multilateral development banks and other development financial institutions are loans, which means that the developing countries will have to pay back to those who lend those loans. However, an alternative can be that the majority of those development finance can be in the format of grant, which will not only provide resources to support efforts in developing countries, but also can work with the current debt stress that's really happening to a lot of the developing countries. So the debt stress in developing countries is the constraints that prevent developing countries from taking on more loans, which can provide the very much needed resources for them to work on climate change efforts.
Coming up next, the demand for green investment in China will reach $76 trillion by 2050, leaving a significant gap to be filled. How to mobilize financing at that scale?
Mobilization of quite significant investment, private investment, together with financial sector reforms.
Greenwashing is becoming more prevalent in private investments as companies make ESG promises. How to avoid it?
Better definition, better disclosure requirements, and a better verification system.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk, real business. Join the conversation. BizTalk, only on CGTN.
Dr. Eckhart, you have now prepared country climate and development reports for several countries. The report stresses the importance of mobilizing private sector financing. What recommendations do you have to mobilize financing at scale, and what makes China different from other countries?
The first one is that the report argues that achieving China's climate goals, namely peaking carbon emissions before 2030 and achieving carbon neutrality by 2060, are both economically and technically feasible, but they require two things to happen. One is mobilization of quite significant investment. In fact, the report finds that about 17 trillion of additional investment are needed just to meet the needs in the transport and energy sector, two of the main sectors of carbon emissions in China. And the second finding is that while financing is necessary, it's not sufficient, and that mobilizing financing will need to be accompanied by reforms and policies to adjust relative prices in the economy and to reflect the social cost of carbon through various forms, either regulations, explicit carbon pricing, of course, in China's case, the emissions trading system that has been put in place, but also broader structural reforms to allow markets, including financial markets, to respond to those changing price signals efficiently and to mobilize this investment. And in this context, of course, China is a case in point. Public financing will have to be used for certain things, including de-risking private investment, partly addressing some of the distributional implications and protecting some of the communities and industries that will likely be negatively affected by a move towards decarbonization, as Dr. Ma has also highlighted, ensuring a just transition. But then you will also need private investment, including in sectors like energy and transport, where a conducive regulatory and policy environment is necessary, carry out some of these investments that are increasingly good for the climate, but they are also good in an economic sense and can help generate the next wave of innovation, job creation in the economy.
It would take a large amount of money for China to achieve its carbon peak and neutrality goals. According to a report by the Green Finance Committee, China's cumulative demand for green and low-carbon investment in the next 3 decades will reach $76.17 trillion. These investments will promote economic growth by contributing to a decline in net energy imports, large green investments, more jobs in low-carbon industries, and technological progress. Despite this, such a massive investment remains a long way off. What are the remaining challenges that we need to overcome in order to achieve this goal?
On annual average basis, this translates into roughly 16 trillion RMB per year, which needs to be mobilized. I think only half of that is mobilized already, and the gap is huge. So going forward, we need to modify, improve our green financial system in several aspects. One is definition of green and the transition activities. And the second thing is really about disclosure. Now we're moving towards carbon-related disclosure. We will be requiring the corporates and also the financial institutions such as banks to report the carbon intensity of their activities, including lending activities. So by doing so, they will know the current level of carbon intensity and what kind of carbon reduction they can achieve in the coming few years through green finance. And the third effort is to incentivize decarbonization. And at the central bank level last year, the PBOC introduced this decarbonization facility, which offers very low-cost funding through commercial banks. The funding is as cheap as 1.75% annualized rate. Obviously, it reduces the funding cost of the projects. At project level, some of the renewable projects are now receiving loans at the rate of only 2.9%, which is much lower than before, largely because of this decarbonization facility. And going forward, we should have more of such facilities, including for transition finance. Also, product innovation is important.
And Mr. Tan, what are your views and comments on how to further scale up investment and finance in the sector?
I feel that the private sector will be a very big potential, areas we need to, encourage them, making more efforts. Of course, that's based on the very good, policy environment. In particular, private, financial institutions can be deeply involved in the climate change, including biodiversity. Otherwise, difficult for the private sector, to make some of the contributions and efforts in this regard. And also, of course, by the end, impossible to achieve our goals from the big, gap of the financial resources that Dr. Ma mentioned. Half, gap, in fact, we're fitting. But where is the coming from of the financial resources? Private sector will be the good potential, but based on the, what policies, what incentives that can be provided.
In an era where more and more consumers and governments are interested in protecting the climate and stressing ESG, greenwashing needs to be taken more seriously. Greenwashing involves providing misleading information about the environmental impact of a company's products and operations, in addition to destroying a company's reputation and damaging consumer trust. Greenwashing exposes businesses and industries to a wide range of government fines. And Ms. Liu, in your opinion, should we worry about the risk of greenwashing?
I think one of the useful tools is to increase the transparency, accountability, and also having more tracking of where the progress has been. But also, we will need the private financial institutions to disclose their roadmap and also the short-term and mid-term targets to check if they are on the track to meet net zero targets around 2040. And also another level of the accountability can be also on what detailed information that the private financial institutions need to disclose, which can help us to, again, track if they are on the right track of meeting the net zero target. This can include, for instance, a disclosure on their investment in fossil fuel, and also a disclosure on their transition plan of walking away from the fossil fuel sector, and also some of the carbon intensity sector, as Dr. Ma has said, how they can use some of the ongoing discussion on the transition financial standards. That's another way that private financial institutions can better disclose their information and making sure they are on the right track to achieve the targets.
May I add a few words on that?
Sure, Dr. Ma, go ahead.
In China, of course, it's an ongoing, discussion topic. I think three aspects are very important. Number one, we need to clearly define what green activities are. If there's no definition or too many definitions, it's going to be creating a lot of greenwashing opportunities. The second thing is disclosure. Part of the problem today is that there are too many requirements of disclosure which are inconsistent with each other. Different countries putting different requirements. Some are mandatory, some are semi-compulsory, some are voluntary, and even the same indicator, which may have different meanings from different countries. The third thing is that even if the data are disclosed according to some requirements, such data may not be true. And to address that problem, we need to have verification from third party, better definition, better disclosure requirements, and a better verification system.
Coming up next, the green finance market is expanding rapidly in China. Which areas offer additional growth potential?
We need to encourage more private sector, not only for the renewable energy, but also for the adaptations of the city, for the biodiversity.
China invests heavily in overseas green projects. To expand the scale and results of those efforts, what more can be done?
For overseas investment, more efforts and resources allocated to make projects bankable.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Regarding the development of green finance in China, and what are some of the remaining challenges?
Now, I think what we say is that in many ways, while green financial markets have grown quite rapidly in China, more potential is there, and in fact is needed in order for China to meet these investment needs that we have been talking about. And if, for example, if we look at various financial markets, so in case of loans, which is the dominant form of financing available in China's economy, only 8% or so of the current loan book are labeled as green. There's some part of the investment needs that is basically investment in existing technologies, scaling up, renewable energy generation, investing in grids, and so on. But there's also an important part of the investment needs that relate to essentially investing in emerging new technologies. And there, loan financing is often not the best way to finance those sort of venture innovative activities that require, for example, a different type of risk sharing and often require early stage equity financing and risk capital.
And Mr. Tang, what's your views and comments on the development of China's sustainable finance market, and what new and innovative finance instruments and solutions can we explore?
A number of the good progress achieved, not only for the pilot activities in different cities, different provinces, and in different financial institutions, but also a number of the financial products has been developed. However, we're still facing some of the lack of the maybe demand and the necessity actions that need to be taken in the near future. So, for instance, as I mentioned, we need to encourage more private sector, to involve the financial investment in China in the areas not only for the renewable energy, but also for the adaptations of the city, for the biodiversity. But currently, and not much, financial resources flowed from central public sectors of the financial and the private financial institutions into that areas. But at the same time, so we're facing very urgent demands regarding to the energy storage facilities. Without energy storage, energy impossible to moving generated renewable energy from western parts of China to the central and the eastern part of China. And without that, facilities in the futures, I'm not quite sure that any renewable energy sectors can be smoothly, developed and enlarging in China, but also in other regions and other countries.
In pursuit of the carbon emissions peak and neutrality goals, green finance has become a new growth engine for banks in China. During the first half of this year, 8 listed domestic banks saw their green loan issuance expand more than 40% from the end of last year. Globally, China's green loans and bonds are performing well. As of June, outstanding green loans in China exceeded 19 trillion yuan. The outstanding green bonds totaled 1.2 trillion yuan, among the largest in the world. What do you think are the most important factors that have contributed to this success?
As I said, the green financial system is an ecosystem. We realized in the earlier days, as early as as in 2014, that we need to take a top-down approach to design a green financial system. And that's why we came up with this Green Finance Guideline in 2016, which was jointly issued by 7 ministries. So it was a coordination internally within China. We involved the PBOC, the Ministry of Finance, the other financial regulators, including those on banking, insurance, and securities, as well as the environmental ministry. So all ministries in this consortium came up with their contributions to the policy making process and also the ecosystem development. That's what we call the top-down approach. And that really helped in China. Without this government coordination, I think it was impossible to move that fast. I think the government has to play this convening role in developing these rules and infrastructure. Of course, it's not just the government. It's actually a model of private and public sector partnership. A lot of policies and standards, in fact, were drafted by private sector experts, including those organized by China's Green Finance Committee. And so the interaction within China between the public and private sector is extremely healthy, in my view. We involve the private sector experts in the development of standards, such as taxonomy and disclosure requirements, and in all kinds of consultation on product development between the government and the private sector. I think that was a key success factor for China's green finance, as of today.
Ms. Liu, could you share with us your views and comments on the future development of China's green finance market?
For overseas investment that China is providing, this is also very important. And I think there could be more efforts in coordinating private and public finance. Take the example of the renewable energy project that China has been investing overseas. If there could be more efforts and resources allocated by the public investors in China to help host countries in providing and more bankable projects that can actually help to unlock the private capital from China, who has a big appetite in the overseas renewable energy projects. And that will be one example of how the coordination between the different investors can help to mobilize the private finance with public finance.
Indeed, more needs to be done to further unlock the potential of green finance in the future. And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to all of you. Sebastian Eckhart, Practice Manager for Macroeconomics and Fiscal at World Bank. Tang Dingding, former Chair of Compliance Review Panel of Asian Development Bank. Ma Jun, Co-Chair of G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. Shuang Liu, China Finance Director at World Resources Institute. And that's all for our special edition of BizTalk, Financing the Greener Future. Thanks for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.